Councillors and IMSB members, I'll assume on some of these issues that there is a broad consensus and support for it, but if you want a division called, please feel free to do so. We come to item number 10 on the agenda, which is the Council's submission on draft government policy, the draft government policy statement on land transport, and also the draft national rail plan. Sorry, now I've just had a complaint that people couldn't hear. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I'll ask Councillor Chris Darby to move and Councillor Josephine Bartley to second it. This is normally a planning committee subject, and I'll ask them also to speak first on it after we've heard from our officers. Let me just double check that we have our officers on the line. Do I have Jim Fraser and Ryan Falconer on the line, please?
Yes, Your Worship, Jim Fraser here.
Okay, so can it's been moved by Councillor Darby, seconded by Councillor Bartley, and if I can ask you to speak to it, please, Jim.
Yes, yeah, Your Worship. I've got a presentation which I'm having difficulty loading. The committee secretary might be able to assist in by putting it up. Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Your Worship. I'm just going to do a quick presentation on around the GPS. My colleague Ryan Falconer will present on the national rail plan. Quickly going through it. Can we flick to the next page, please? Just giving an overview of what the GPS is, the key directions that are outlined in the GPS, and the funding allocations also. The priorities of GPS 2018. Safety remains a priority with the wording updated to reflect the Road to Zero strategy. Access remains a priority, but is now covered by two parts to provide clearer guidance, with GPS 2021 continues to support better transport travel options and well-connected freight routes is the other priority area. The environment remains a priority with a focus on investment that aligns with government's greenhouse gas reduction targets. Next page, please. To achieve these priorities, GPS 2001 allocates funding to focus investment on implementing the Road to Zero interventions through a specific Road to Zero activity class, amounting to around $10 billion over 10 years, including around $1.2 billion additional investment in local roads. Implementing freight and some interregional rail network investments defined in the draft New Zealand rail plan through a specific rail network activity class. Implementing the metropolitan rail network investment defined in the draft national rail plan and approved under the previous transition rail activity class through a public transport infrastructure activity class. Public transport in cities and expand expanding the public transport system to support new housing and interregional commuting, with over $1 billion per year allocated to public transport through a specific public transport activity class, services activity class. Next page, please. To achieve sorry, a bit explain. To achieve these priorities is also shaping land use and urban form and street design in a way that reduces car dependency, making walking, cycling and micromobility safe and attractive travel choices, around $1 billion allocated for walking and cycling. Implementing mode shift plans to shape urban form, make shared and active modes more attractive, and influencing travel demand in transport choices. Improving mode choices for moving freight by coastal shipping through a specific coastal shipping activity class. And finally, a transition to a low carbon transport system through reducing transport demand and interconnected infrastructure, encouraging walking, cycling and the use of public transport and the use of rail and coastal shipping for moving freight. The GPS also has dedicated funding for delivering on government commitments. The activity classes include sufficient funding to cover the central government share for government's commitments to the Auckland Transport Alignment Project, Let's Go Wellington Moving, Road to Zero, and to the New Zealand Rail Plan. The Crown funding of $6.8 billion to progress new infrastructure projects. The New Zealand Upgrade Program builds on investments through the fund. This is not included in the activity classes, so it brings the overall investment in land transport system to around $54 billion over the next 10 years. Next slide, please. Recommendations. It's recommended our submission is largely supportive of the GPS. It supports the GPS's strategic direction and investment priority given to safety, better travel options, improving freight connections and climate change. These investment priorities are generally well aligned with the Council's priorities identified in the Auckland Plan 2050. It requests, however, that greater clarity around the climate change priority needs to be reflected in transport systems investment and how the better travel options priority is to be delivered. It is not clear how reducing greenhouse gas emissions will be achieved through actions across all priorities, programs and activity classes. In the absence of a dedicated pool of funding, more clarity and direction is required as to how emissions reductions will drive investment decisions across activity class. It's also not clear how the better travel options priority is to be delivered, how implementing the Auckland mode shift plan is to be funded, how will Waka Kotai prioritise investments that support compact urban forms, as this is the most effective means of promoting mode shift. Submission supports the increased funding allocation for road safety through the new Vision Zero class, an additional $1.2 billion investment in local road safety improvements and $3 billion in state highway safety improvements. It supports the dedicated funding from the National Land Transport Fund for rail, network maintenance and renewal as part of the integration of rail network planning and land transport system. Next page, please. Our submission supports the government's confirmation that it will fund the Auckland Transport Alignment Project. It supports the neutral mode neutral approach to transport planning investment decisions. It supports the suggested approach to better integrated land use and transport outcomes, but requests greater clarity around how Auckland's quality compact growth strategy will be enabled. They've suggested a range of minor word changes as well. Next page, please. Any questions? Thank you.
Okay, before we take questions, I think we'll run through Ryan's presentation as well, and then we'll deal with the two together. So are you there, Ryan? Sorry, Ryan, are you with us? I can't hear anything from you. We might have lost Ryan from the call. If I can't pick him up now, I might just move back to ask. We'll run questions and comments. Okay, Ryan's going to try and dial in. So while he's dialing in, what I'm going to suggest is if I can ask Councillor Chris Darby and Councillor Josephine Bartley if they would like to open up the questions and comments. We'll run the two together, and if you could put on the comment line if you'd like to comment or ask a question on this topic while Chris and Josephine are speaking to it. While we're waiting for Ryan, Chris, I might just ask you to make some introductory comments and if you've got any questions.
Thanks, Mayor. Look, I've added your name to the delegation to sign this off because my feeling is, Mayor, that there might be a little bit more than just edits here. And I appreciate the work that Jim's been doing on this, but I think there might be some gaps that will come out of our conversation here today, which I think you need some oversight of as well. Probably let's just sit with questions at the moment. And Jim, thanks for your outline here. At the very top of this document, it talks about the GPS or the transport system improving people's well-being and livability of places. But as you proceed into the document, sorry, if somebody could turn the mic off there.
Yeah, could everybody please make sure when they're not speaking have their mic off because we're getting some extraneous sound through. Councillor Darby?
Thanks, Matt. As you move into the document, it seems to lose sight of the livability of places emphasis. And I think you have given some emphasis to that in part. We all know that transport and land use are linked like with an umbilical cord, but this document still introduces that concept, but doesn't really hold it. And so my first question to you, Jim, in your consideration of our submission, do you think we adequately give weight to what I see as some weak linkages to land use here? First question.
Jim, would you like to comment on that? I'll get Councillor Darby to ask his questions and then I'll come back to Ryan Falconer, who's on the line now.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. That's good. Thanks, Jim.
Apologise for that. Yeah, I do think we haven't stressed that or really addressed that issue that you just raised. I suppose it's been focused on our response has been that certainly the priority areas that have been identified are ones that will significantly address or improve well-being and livability. So it probably does lose that link a little bit between actually how it achieves that those priorities. So yeah, we probably could submit a little bit more on that.
Okay, because when you look at under climate change, it's got the primary outcome, but it doesn't consider, high density mixed use transit oriented development as a primary outcome. It's like a co-benefit, it's a secondary outcome. So look, if we can address that, I think you're addressing the climate change matters to be further reinforced. One of the things that I noticed there was that climate change reductions, it says on page 22, taking account of climate change reduction targets, not giving effect to. And I think that's just an absolute out opportunity. Have you noticed that, the wording there?
Sorry, Chris, what page is that?
It's on page 22 of the GPS submission, and it's under climate change, and it identifies the primary outcome.
Yep, environmental sustainability, is that the one?
Yeah, it's under, you see primary outcome 69, and then on the fourth line it says taking account of emissions reduction targets. Taking account is a weak direction. Giving effect to is instructive.
Yeah, agree.
So Mayor, it's difficult to go through this in a Skype meeting, but there are some gaps here. I think you raised also some concern, Jim, about how the climate change outcomes were going to be delivered, and the narrative doesn't really go into that. But when you go into, there is a section on the narrative, I think it's under funding, it talks about the emissions reduction plan informed by the Climate Change Commission. It seems to rely a lot on that.
Yes. Yeah, I think that one, that hasn't been, this is relating to their targets and budgets, I think, which haven't been set yet. So I think it's, and also just going back, reflecting on your comment about, in that paragraph about taking account of, I think it's taking, it's about these proposed budgets and targets which haven't been released yet. So I think that's part of the issue. It's relying on something which is, hasn't been set yet.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Look, it's really hard to rewrite the report, as Councillor Darby said, on a Skype line. But what I'm going to do is come back to Ryan Falconer, ask him to speak to the National Rail Plan submission, and then just again to invite any councillors that want to ask questions or have an input. I've got Shane Henderson down, but if there's any other councillors that want to ask questions or make comments, we'll take those after Ryan's presentation. So Ryan, you're on the line with us, I think, and
yes.
If you want to take us through your presentation, you don't need to read the whole thing out. If you can just summarise each page as we go through it, that would be fine, and councillors will be able to read it on screen as well.
Happy to. I presume I can be heard okay this time.
You're being heard loud and clear.
Excellent. Right, let's proceed. I do have half a dozen slides, but we can move through those relatively quickly. It's worth bearing in mind that the component, the National Rail Plan, the component of our submission for the National Rail Plan is included with the submission for the GPS, the reason being the close linkage between the two, and also the fact that the formal advertising of both occurred simultaneously and the submission deadline is the same. So just asked to continue on the next slide. Thank you. Thank you. So in terms of headlines, the focus of the National Rail Plan is very much on the longer-term outlook for rail in New Zealand. It's a non-statutory document, intended to be a non-statutory document, and does establish strategic priorities for rail. I've provided some of the headlines on that slide there. As the Mayor said, I won't run through all of them. However, there will be recollection of our submission in February pertinent to the Land Transport Rail Amendment Bill that AT, Auckland Transport, also submitted on, and we presented a summary of that submission to Select Committee also in February. The verbal submission was well received, and we're aware that that legislation remains, or the bill at least, remains in select committee at this time. We've been keeping an eye on that. Critically too, I'll point out that there is significant reference in the draft National Rail Plan to ATAP for Auckland, which is of course critical. It's a matter we've been talking to the ministry staff about for some months, so there has been some advice provided in the formation of this draft document, which means there's a reasonable level of support for a lot of the content, which we'll get to fairly shortly. Just move to the next slide. Just try clicking the cursor there if you don't mind. Thank you. So I've added that in there just to give a bit of a sense of where ATAP sits within the context of the draft National Rail Plan, the National Rail Plan there shown in the circle. The diagram there is from the draft itself, the intention being to show the relationship of the plan to other statutory documentation, including the GPS, our regional land transport plans, and Wellington's of course, and also the Rail Network Investment Program, which you may recollect from the development of our submission pertinent to the Rail Bill, that being a new statutory obligation as part of legislative change, and that being the piece that talks about the investment priorities for the rail network over the next 3 years with a 10-year outlook. So the linkage then, as I've mentioned, is to ATAP at a strategic level, being informative not only for regional land transport plans, but also development of the ARNET. So I'll move on, thank you. Jim has actually run through a number of the key points in terms of the relationship of the draft National Rail Plan to the draft GPS. Critically, there's mention of key projects in the context of Auckland, as well as Wellington, from a passenger rail network perspective. Notwithstanding, we're aware of funding commitments that have been made by the government more recently as part of the New Zealand upgrade package, and what we would expect to see is finalisation of this plan accounting for those changed circumstances. Next slide, please. Thank you. Jim's mentioned the division of activity classes. The key point to make is that some of the investment we would expect to see ongoing in Auckland around metropolitan passenger service and operations and the like are under different activity classes to the rail network activity class in the draft GPS 2021. The particular focus of the rail network activity class in the GPS is on primarily freight operations and improvement of the network to a state of good repair. It's not on providing for metropolitan passenger rail services in the sense of operations and those sorts of things. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in the context of our recommendations for submission, I'll point out that we have liaised with Auckland Transport in the development of our submission content that was latterly last week, and early this week we had conversation around the issues. There is good alignment between submissions as we might expect. Very similar submission points, and we understand that AT submission will go to board on the 8th of May, the submission date being the 11th of May. So again, good consistency in terms of points made, and critically the areas of support, particularly around the long-term outlook for rail planning investment in New Zealand, that being a key thing that is being addressed not only through the rail plan but through the proposed legislative change subject to the previous submission. Support for those two strategic priorities, one being freight, but also critically for Auckland metropolitan passenger rail services, and strong support, of course, for ATAP as a guiding document for investment in Auckland's transport system. That includes, but not limited to, rail. Thank you. Next slide, and this will be the last one. So we have some recommendations and suggestions regarding minor wording changes, which are included in our draft submission, but particularly around the references through the National Rail Plan document, the draft National Rail Plan document, to the legislative reform that's proposed, and in particular the bill that we've submitted on. So we would seek to see updates accordingly to the plan before it's finalised, taking into account our strong position around things like full integration of rail with other forms of land transport, rather than the partial integration option that's proposed in the bill. various other things, including preservation of the integrity of our network access agreements and those sorts of things. So those points we would anticipate seeing also in Auckland Transport submissions, certainly in drafting of our submissions. Those are key points that we have shared. So that would be the main points I'd like to summarise. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Ryan. That's pretty clear. So we're looking at both reports together. And just to give Councillor Josephine Bartley as the seconder, are there any comments or questions that you'd like to make at this point?
I think our submission is good, but I did, thank you, Mia, for the opportunity. I did want to ask some questions around economic development in the GPS and the better, freight connections, and whether we feel that there's enough in the GPS to explain or to measure that outcome in terms of increased economic productivity being, that it should be one of the outcomes of that freight connections bit. Any thoughts on that?
Jim, that question to you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you now, Jim.
Thank you. Certainly the priority around freight movement is focused on achieving an economic development outcome. The other priority areas don't seem to be a bit more focused on achieving other types of outcomes with less, although they have co-benefits. A lot of them have co-benefits in terms of economic prosperity. So the focus is there. It's just not set up as a priority area, I suppose. Economic development's not set up as a priority area. It's really the other priority areas have, in most cases, economic development benefits. But yeah.
Thank you, Jim. Councillor Bartley, any further questions on that?
Maybe it's something we can mention in our submission then, given, the COVID economic recovery being a priority. And yeah, it's because there's a big focus on the walking and cycling, which is good.
Yep.
But, it's mentioned, freight connections is mentioned, and it should be an outcome, a strong outcome.
Yeah, there is definitely an outcome. I suppose it's just not identified as a priority area for, achieving. It's not just identified as a priority area, but it is definitely identified as one of the outcomes of one of the priority area or of the other priority areas.
Thank you.
Sorry, if I could just add, only 2 local boards, given that this is actually quite important, are we working with local board services to get more input from the rest of the boards by the 10th of May?
The local boards have been informed about the GPS. We have received another one. I've just received one recently from, apologies, I can't remember who it was. But we are expecting to get some feedback from the other local boards as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I've had 2 councillors indicate a desire to ask questions or make comments. Shane Henderson and Wayne Walker. Shane, you're next.
Hello. Thanks, Mr. Mayor, and thanks to staff for working on these. It's really good work. Look, I've got a question / comment about where this sits with the Port Futures study. It's quite funny to think that something that was so huge and looming and important is something that doesn't really occupy our discussions much anymore. But just for the record, I've long wanted detail around how freight is supposed to move through the Western Line and in great number and all through the night, given that there are a lot of residents that live along that line, and including housing that has recently gone in places next to places like Sunnyvale train station. So where does the strategy actually fit with the Port Futures study?
Thanks, Councillor. Ryan here. I can probably provide some comment. unsurprisingly, perhaps I did think that this might come up, and fair and reasonable question it is. So, look, the situation is, of course, we are unclear on the results of analysis, which we understand to be ongoing, pertinent to the study, the new study that has been commissioned by Treasury and the Ministry of Transport regarding port futures and port options. And at this time, we don't have information pertinent to which particular port options have been developed strategically and assessed strategically, and then what the implications would be from an infrastructure perspective. So from my point of view, for the draft National Rail Plan, to put in any signposts regarding infrastructure requirements would be premature. However, what we have done as part of our proposed submission is include some recommend clarification around wording, as the timing of the draft, as it was released informally in December of last year, made reference to the port work done last year, and we've made it clear in our submission we believe to continue with those references would be inappropriate given the new work underway. So the anticipation is that when this is finalised around July of this year, that there would be a stock take taken of work completed as part of ongoing port investigations, and that prior to that time, councillors would be, and council staff would be made aware of the results of the work, the analytical work, including transport impact assessment work that's being conducted. But we understand too, given current circumstances with the COVID crisis, that ministry staff attention is elsewhere, and that maybe some of the original timeframes discussed with the governing body back, I believe it was January, those might have been pushed out. We're just not clear on what those timeframes are now.
Thank you, that's great. Cheers.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think we're all waiting to see what comes out of the government analysis of the Working Party report. But as you suggest, I think it's been put on the back burner while people are focused on COVID-19. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Sure. Just got some issues. I don't know how we can reflect them in our submission. As it goes to climate change, there are two aspects. There's mitigation, reducing emissions, and then adaptation. It looks like adaptation is under transport outcomes, under resilience and security, but it references the National Adaptation Plan that's yet to come. Okay, that hasn't been developed yet. It might be mid-year, it might be later on this year. The impact of that can conceivably be massive in respect of transport investment. And the related issue is around just the 10-year duration of the planning, which is not adequate when it comes to both mitigation and also adaptation, particularly because significant parts of the roading network and the rail network are very close to sea level. So I just want to put that on the map. Resilience is a critical consideration. COVID has hit us there. Climate change is coming. So just invite your comment there.
Thank you, Councillor. Jim or Ryan, either of you got comments on that?
Yeah, resilience is throughout the document in terms of its emphasis on it, but it's not identified as a specific outcome, but definitely included throughout the document. I agree with your comments, Councillor Walker, that the National Adaptation Plan, when that's actually released, it will have significant impacts in terms of being able to, or in terms of perhaps diverting investment to address those issues.
And then the other comment that concerns me, and again this goes to rail and the relationship between rail and the transport document, there's mention of full integration of rail. A particular concern that I've got is the ongoing move not to progress heavy rail to the airport, when that could well have a much better business case and be far more resilient and add resilience to the network. And I'd invite a comment there.
Thanks, Councillor. Ryan here. I'm happy to provide a couple of comments and also just step back and supplement a little bit of what Jim said regarding climate change and resilience. So there is a significant amount of work ongoing, of course, in this space broadly, not just within council, but obviously with other agencies for any manner of different reasons, everything from the adaptation side, based on the assets of individual agencies right through to, of course, the mitigation side, and the need to work through established processes such as ATAP, of which, of course, there's an update proposed to that, and we're involved as council staff helping lead some of the climate change pieces to that. One thing I would say is that I believe nationally we lack at the moment a clear and certainly universal and well-supported definition of what a climate lens really looks like when we're assessing something as complicated as our national land transport system. But rest assured, there's a lot of thinking and effort going into that right now. But yes, there is a matter of timing with this, given, for example, the Climate Change Commission's recommended emissions budgets wouldn't be made, be publicised potentially later in the year in draft, but wouldn't come into effect till February 1, 2020. So yes, there's definitely a timing issue. With respect for rail connections to the airport, not in a position to be able to comment on the current status of consideration of options for connection to the airport as to the process being run and also the timing of any announcements. So unfortunately, I understand exactly the point you're making, but probably one distinction, that I would make further is that the National Rail Plan, much like the rail bill considered in February, focuses explicitly on heavy rail as opposed to light rail. So light rail would be something captured in other documentation, including but not limited to the GPS.
Thank you. IMSP member Glenn Wilcox. Glenn, have we got you on the line?
Yes, sorry. Yep. Sorry, Mayor.
That's okay.
It's a little while to get my stuff going. My first question really relates to the Māori impact statement. I suppose it's the number 53, and the statement that Māori are overrepresented in low-income areas. I'm kind of over this negativity coming from a deficit basis for Māori. And with regards to the submission, and I think this is the lapo of my kōrero and papai, and this is actually Māori were right there at transport right from the beginning. The Native Land Act 1852 meant that 5% of all Māori land went to roading. The Y312 claim was exactly about the North Auckland line and the land that was given for that railway line by the tribes of Ngāti Whātua and others. So, I mean, I'm not seeing anything representing that in this draft. And I know we're looking forward, but you can't go forward unless you make sure you have a platform on which to stand on. And I don't see anything there that says in this draft that recognition that Māori are part of the transport and the whole transport infrastructure and have been there from the beginning. So that's my first question. The second question is, I don't see anything from a climate change point of view with regards to electrification besides us doing the Pukekohe Papakura one, because whether we upgrade rail or put a third line in or whatever, unless we're going to electrification for the locomotive stock, we basically may as well be just keep using diesels. And yeah, well, where does that lead us? So those are the two questions. Thank you.
Okay, Jim or Ryan, I think, if either of you want to comment on either aspect of those two questions.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for the question. Ryan, again, maybe just speaking to the second question, the one relating to rail. So the point regarding electrification, I acknowledge that it's in there as a future priority and is discussed as a particular case study. It's something actually that has come up in discussion at a staff level. So the question has come up regarding where work is sort of focused and the timeliness of some of these proposals, including a future priority as set like electrification outside of Auckland's metropolitan network. There's also has been, over the last few months, work done by the Ministry of Transport, a green freight strategy, a green freight paper which has been developed, and that considered in part, but certainly not focused on freight operations from the perspective of rail. So what I would suggest, certainly from my perspective, yes, it would be good to accelerate at least consideration, if not implementation, of lower carbon intensity infrastructure like electrified rail. From a ministry perspective, from the discussions we've had, there's of course a focus in the first 10 years, certainly the first 3, but definitely the first 10-year outlook on improving the state of repair of the existing network, which is of course largely for diesel operations, with a view in time as well as technology matures to ascertain whether investment in something like electrification more widely is cost effective or an alternative fuel becomes more cost effective, and that could be something like hydrogen. So that said, I'm certainly not an expert on fuel applications in rail, but there is a matter of timing that does come in here. But your point is certainly well made around decarbonising the broader network.
And just to your first point, Member Wilcox, Megan here, I'm really keen to understand and get your guidance, please, on how we could make it clearer in our submission around Māori involvement, but I guess in past and in the future. So perhaps if I could start that offline with you with an email, and we can have a conversation as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Megan. Now, I'm going to come to the last question, comment I've got is from Pippa Coombe, and then I'm going to invite Councillor Darby just to come back in. You'll see that we've made a small change in B, which is not just the minor editing change, but Councillor Darby, you had a desire to beef up the section on climate change and also livability. So if I can just get you to concisely summarise the sort of things that you're looking at putting in there, because we'll need the approval of this meeting in order to do that. Sorry, I've got one other question coming after Pippa Coombe, Daniel Newman. Pippa?
Kia ora, Your Worship, it's David. I'd also like to say something in regards to B, if I may, when it's going.
Sure, and David Typery, I'll add to the list too.
Good on. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. More of a comment. I just want to thank the team for the work on the submission and to acknowledge that really this is quite significant in terms of the first time that the GPS has been so aligned with Auckland's strategies and focus, and particularly around road safety and the transport funding priorities. So I think it is quite significant because it's very rare that we do have this alignment with central government. And so I'm very happy for the change that has been proposed just to ensure that we beef up the submission where we do have that language that we've already approved through our strategies and plans, and particularly giving effect to the climate change actions. And I think that, for example, in the summary, it doesn't actually say those words, but it's in the body of the submission. So that seems to be an important point that really needs to be emphasised. So just a comment in terms of the alignment, that we've already got a lot of what's gone into the submission has been already approved through our planning and strategies, and also just to support making that clear in the resolution that the delegated group can beef up the submission to ensure that we get the language right, and that also picking up Member Wilcox's points as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. I think it is worth emphasising that there is quite good alignment between Council's position and the government's position, and that it's good to see again set out very clearly that we will get the full amount under the Auckland Transport Alignment Project, the 16.3 billion that was originally undertaken, but then came under questioning when there were budgetary problems in the NZTA. So both of those points are important. Councillor Daniel Newman.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. I wasn't going to speak, but I can see what's going on at B, and I'm a little uncomfortable with this. I mean, I've read the draft GPS. There are 3 ministers, and clearly this is a document that has been heavily influenced by Minister Twyford and Minister Jones. So it is a focus on rail, particularly regional rail, which is Minister Jones's priorities, and a focus on housing, which is Minister Twyford. I think that the wording around taking account, which is set out in the GPS, it very clearly reflects where the government is going here, and I don't think that it will entertain stronger wording than that, particularly noting that this is a 5-month-old document now, written prior to a global pandemic, and that the changing economic landscape of COVID-19 means that it will be harder to move from aspiration to implementation, I think, in the first 2 years of the GPS when it comes to funding priorities. So the other thing I think which is pertinent in relation to this document is that it is almost certainly going to be the case, and the document is written noting the emerging role of the HUD, and I would expect that the government will be quite sympathetic to future residential and suburban and greenfields development, which is going to require complementary support and investment of the transport network. My concern for the officers actually isn't so much the wording in relation to the climate change strategic priority. It's actually in terms of the funding for the local transport network maintenance and renewals. So I think I know where B is going to go with this delegated group making changes to the submission. I don't think that's going to flow through to amendments to the GPS, however, but I do think that it would be helpful if we could understand exactly what the proposed funding lines in the GPS mean for the maintenance of the local road network, because that will be a challenge, particularly for outer suburban communities as we continue to see future development, which will be supported by the government.
Thank you. Is any comment from Ryan or Jim on Councillor Newman's points?
Councillor Newman, Jim Fraser here. Yeah, in terms of your concern around the funding for local roading, maintenance and renewals, the GPS does actually signal that there is a significant increase in funding in those areas. So in terms of the current funding ability, that there is actually going to be a lot more money directed in that direction. The impact of COVID in terms of the revenue for funding is of course of potential concern.
Yeah, I think we're just in response. Yeah, I accept that there is additional funding, but it doesn't necessarily get timed at the point where the funding is needed. I mean that there are networks that have been under strain for a long time, so the ability to ramp up funding to address that gap in a short time is constrained. And I think that I'd reiterate the challenge around this document, which was of course prepared at a time when the when the call on the Crown's budget and the sources of funding for the NLTF were obviously affected prior to.
Sorry, Councillor, we've lost that last part of your comment. Yeah, I think we also need to take into account that, of course, we've put into our shovel-ready projects in our one of the top 30 priorities is the renewal question. Have we got you back on the line, Daniel?
Yeah. Look, I mean,
finish that would be good.
Yeah. Look, I guess it's probably. I mean, I guess given COVID-19, it's probably best to let the government and to let the funding streams that come into the LTF in LTF reflect the reality that we are in a constrained environment. It's going to be difficult, at least initially, to try and achieve some of these funding paths.
Yep, that may well be. This is just a reminder to everybody, this is a submission to the government on those areas, so it's something they take into account, but it's not something that they have to implement. They make the final decision, but it's important that we express our views. Just before we come back to Councillor Darby, just to summarise the points that he wanted to change, David Taipere.
Kia ora, Your Worship. Just quickly, in terms of the Independent Māori Statutory Board member in B, I think it should be the chair, particularly in the current state with the Emergency Committee being the fact that I'm the most consistent member in the committee and bringing others in. So I'd just like to propose that. And secondly, just to reiterate what Member Wilcox was saying, which is across the board really, about the recognition of Māori and the contributions they've made to infrastructure and economy, and particularly around land being acquired, various other things that have been done. So again, just reiterating what Member Wilcox said. Kia ora.
Thank you, Member Taipere. Yeah, look, with the approval of the mover and seconder, we can make that more explicit, that it's the chair of the IMSB. Do Councillor Darby, Councillor Bartley, do you have any objection to that?
Absolutely appropriate, thank you.
No objection.
Thank you very much. So look, I'll just come back finally now to Councillor Chris Darby, just to, I think what I took, Councillor, from your earlier comments, you just wanted to beef up the climate change area and to emphasise the placemaking livability aspect. But can you speak briefly to that so we've got an idea and you've got the approval of the committee to make those changes, which may be more than the usual minor change?
Thank you, Mayor. And look, and very briefly, I think we've canvassed it well, and no doubt this will, as government COVID lens, and we'll see something different. But that will be a challenge, a constraint, as somebody said, but it will also present opportunity. Not proposing any.
I'm sorry, Chris, we're losing you again. We have this perennial problem.
Yeah, we do.
Can you start again? It's just start again and let's see how we go. Hopefully, if need be, we can get you back by phone. But try again on Skype. Okay. I think we've lost Chris at this point. But if I'm understanding it correctly, that what he'd like to do is just put a little bit more emphasis in terms of placemaking and livability, and a little more emphasis in terms of climate change reduction. Remembering this is a submission, and this is just putting views and ideas through to government. Have we got you back, Chris? I think we've lost you. Look, in the interest of time, I think unless there's any objection, we'll move to vote on that recommendation. Do you want to do that by division or by voice?
Just a point of order, Mr. Mayor.
Yep, yeah, Councillor Watson.
Yeah, no. So I just want to be. This is rather unusual circumstances, more ways than one here. So essentially, we've got the phrase here: the changes agreed at the meeting. You know, to state the obvious, we haven't agreed. The vote will tell whether we've agreed or not. But I'm assuming from what you're saying, and that there'll be some word changes, and the only changes I picked up from Councillor Darby's various contributions was the use of the phrase "giving effect to" in terms of climate change, and I didn't pick up any specific words that I can recall anyway in relation to livability or whatever those other adjectives used that were. So I guess just for the sake of clarity, I'm assuming that's the changes that we're voting on here that will be included. There won't be then some explanatory paragraph or increased detail other than what we've seen today.
Yep, I'm making the same assumption. What I can ask Councillor Darby to do is just to send the proposed changes around to members of the governing body and the IMSB, but I'm presuming they don't go beyond what he talked about. Personally, I'm happy for a greater emphasis on climate change, and equally just reference to placemaking as part of what they need to take into account. It's not the normal way we would do this. I agree with that. Am I with
you now, Mayor?
Okay, we've got Chris back, Councillor Darby back again. I don't know whether you've been listening to this conversation, Councillor, but you might like to comment on it.
Just came in on the back of Councillor Watson's contribution there. So look, what I was saying before I had to reload Skype was I'm not suggesting anything which is inconsistent with our strategic directions, and nothing that's inconsistent with what the officers that have drafted this report here today. So the officer emphasised that there needed to be a strengthening in the climate change area, and I highlighted the words "giving effect to" rather than "taking account of" as an example. I leave the balance to the officers. The document will no doubt change as government consider it through the climate, the COVID lens, and so in terms of livability, at the outset, I asked the question, and the officers responded. At the outset, at the very front end of the document, it talks about the purpose of the transport system contributing to improved livability of places. And I said that in the narrative, that is lost, that story is lost. And the officer responded, he said, yeah, that could be improved. So I'm not writing those words. The officer said that that could be addressed and improved. So I'm just saying to the members here, do you want that improved or not? Because at the moment, the linkages to land use are weak. And Mayor, one other point, on the funding page of the document itself, that's the draft GPS, there is reference to ATAP, but it's good that it identifies, as you pointed out and saw, that it binds in ATAP because it's a non-statutory document, but it only identifies the National Land Transport Fund quantum of 16.3, whereas ATAP identifies, the 18 document, that is, I think at least 18 billion, and that's been improved because it takes into account the City Rail Link contribution and the Crown Infrastructure Partners arrangements that we've made. So I'm just wondering if the officer might like to consider making sure that the full funding of ATAP is identified rather than just the National Land Transport Fund. And then, of course, you've got the New Zealand Upgrade Program funding, which needs to be reflected as well. So that's my point. So I'm not going to write this prescriptively. It's not my job to prescribe this. It's my job to highlight some points, areas that need some polishing, and leaving it with the staff to do that. and they are cognizant of the strategic directions that we've already set. Enough.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor. So what I take from that comment, there are two areas that you just wanted to give effect to more clearly, which was climate change and livability. I'm relaxed about the ATAP funding that I wanted bound in was the 16.3 billion that was at one stage at risk of bureaucrats in Wellington wanting to erode. So the other commitments I think are reasonably clear. If there's some concern, I can treat the changes under B as an amendment moved by Councillor Darby, seconded by Councillor Bartley, and we can vote on the amendment separately if there's a desire to do that. That might be the easiest way to resolve it, but just if any councillor has a preference to vote on that as an amendment, please let me know and we can put it in that way. Question from Councillor Simpson.
Your Worship, my only issue with B is I want to see what is actually written. I mean, I'm sorry that all this work wasn't done prior to today. You've got a paper here that's supposed to be a planning that I would have thought the planning chair would have inputted into already. I actually would just want to see what we're going to send. And if you're asking me to support B, they're not just minor. I'm hearing a list of things that Councillor Darby has just sort of spoken through. So I'm not wanting to support this, but I just want to see what's going to go. And I think it would have been better if all those changes had been done before it came here. So if you want to put an amendment up, fine. But I think in my own heart, I'm going to abstain because I haven't seen the final, and it's not minor. It looks like a lot more than minor. Thank you.
Yeah, look, I appreciate your concern, Councillor. This is not the way that we would normally have done it. I don't think, however, we have the ability to, but let me put it as a question to officers. When does this submission, Megan, maybe you've got an idea, when does the submission have to be in? Because it would be better, sorry if I can finish, it would be better if councillors saw the specific changes rather than voting to make changes, even though they've been outlined by Councillor Darby. Have we got an indication of when that submission has to be put in?
11th of May, so just a couple of weeks away. Not quite 2 weeks.
Okay, well, look, let me make this suggestion.
Next week.
Yeah, let me make that suggestion that we've had the discussion, we don't need to repeat the discussion, but in order to know the specific changes, that we bring it back to we defer it for a week and bring it back to the committee with the changes clearly spelt out. If we've got the time to do that, that's a preferable way of doing it in terms of people knowing precisely what they would be voting in favour of. It may be that it's not controversial at all, but people want to vote on something that is clear rather than not being precisely clear about the changes that might be made. So I make that suggestion. So maybe I can move, if somebody wants to second, that we defer the paper for 1 week pending the chair and deputy chair of the planning committee coming back.
Happy to second.
with the proposed changes. It's been seconded by a number of people. I heard Councillor Simpson, I think, there. So I think that's the simplest way of dealing with it, Councillor Darby. So I'll move that we defer it to the 7th of May emergency
point of order. Sorry, point of order, Mr. Mayor.
Yep, Councillor Koo.
We also had the point that the IMSB members have asked us to include. So can it also go through Chair Taipiri as well?
There's a discussion that was going to take place between Megan Tyler and Glenn Wilcox just to incorporate what Glenn was seeking in that regard. Yeah. Okay, so I think from both of those points of view, it's tidier if we simply bring it back next week. Please next week don't relitigate the whole thing again. We've had probably an hour on this conversation, but I think it's a tidier way to deal with it by bringing back the specific changes recommended. So I'll move accordingly. I've got a seconder. All those in favour, please say aye.
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 Aye. To the contrary. Aye. Carried. Right.
You didn't say no.
Sorry. Oh, I said to the contrary.
I couldn't hear it. Sorry.
Yes. No, I said All those in favour, please say aye. To the contrary,
No.
perhaps I didn't pause quite as long as I should have.
No, I'm no. I would rather have this go through now. There's nothing wrong with it.
Okay, but I'll still declare it carried. Thank you very much. Now, look, we have